The only god is money, and you have nothing, shouted the Millionaire CEO, mocking the faith of the humble farmer and his family. Confident in his fortune, he laughed in the man's face. The farmer, however, did not respond to the insult. With a calmness that irritated the businessman, he opened his briefcase, took out an old, yellowed document, and placed it on the table. The CEO took the paper mockingly, but his smile disappeared the moment he read the name of the true owner of all the lands he was exploiting. The dust from the gravel road billowed up, coating the hood of the gleaming black Escalade belonging to Richard Caldwell, the CEO of a colossal agribusiness corporation. He was here, in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, for the final formality to take possession of the last property standing in the way of his massive hydroelectric dam, a project that would flood the entire valley. The property was a small farm, a stubborn oasis of green belonging to Abel Hayes, a farmer with calloused hands and unshakable faith. The meeting took place on the porch of the simple wooden house, with Abel's wife, Clara, serving a humble coffee that Richard refused with a dismissive wave. He threw the final offer onto the table, a laughable sum that was more of an insult than a proposal. Abel looked at the check, then up at the blue sky. "Sir, your money is a mighty thing, but this land is priceless. It's a promise from God to my family. It's all we have." Richard let out a cruel laugh that echoed through the valley. "God? How naive. Wake up, my friend. The only God in this world is the dollar, and you don't have any," he scoffed, getting to his feet. "I have judges on my payroll and senators on speed dial. This land will be mine with your signature or with a court order. Your faith won't stop my bulldozers." Clara recoiled, offended. But Abel remained calm. He didn't argue. He just bent down and picked up a worn leather satchel that was beside his chair. With a dignified silence, he pulled out an old document. It was a land map, yellowed and fragile, with elaborate script and the wax seals of the British Crown. With steady hands, he unfolded it and placed it over Richard's offer. "You're right, sir. I don't have much money, but this land, in fact, isn't mine." A triumphant smirk spread across Richard's face. "Ah, so you admit it. Who does it belong to? The bank? Name your price. I'll pay it." "It doesn't belong to the bank," Abel said, pointing with a wrinkled finger at a specific line on the document. "Read the name of the true owner, sir." Richard leaned in, the smirk still on his face, and began to read the title of the land grant, dated from over 2 centuries ago. "Granted by His Royal Majesty, full and perpetual ownership of this entire valley, including the river headwaters, to Baron." The name he read next hit him like a lightning bolt. The smirk on his face vanished instantly. He staggered back, his face pale, breaking into a cold sweat. The name of the original owner, the Baron who received those lands from the king himself, was his own great-great-great-grandfather. A branch of the family that his grandfather, in his greed, had disinherited and erased from the records, believing they had died in poverty without leaving any heirs. Abel then pulled a second document from the satchel, his own birth certificate. On it, his mother's name contained the forgotten surname. He was the direct descendant, the rightful heir of the Baron. "My grandfather never wanted to fight over titles, sir. He believed in sharing and in a man's word," Abel said, his voice quiet. "But he kept the documents, just in case one day your family's greed came knocking at our door." Richard looked from the document to the farmer's serene face. The ground beneath his feet had vanished. He wasn't trying to buy a small farm. He had spent the last 5 years investing billions to build a dam on land that by right belonged to the man he had just humiliated. That farmer with nothing wasn't just the owner of the small plot. He was the owner of the entire valley, including the land where Richard's corporate headquarters was being built. "You don't just have the power to stop my project," Richard stammered, panic seizing his voice. "You can take everything from me." Abel picked up the offer check from the table, slowly tore it in two, and let the pieces fall to the ground. "Like I said, sir, the land isn't mine, it's God's. And it seems today he's decided to collect the rent." Richard's world collapsed in silence. A sharp ringing in his ears drowned out the sound of the gentle wind rustling the leaves and the distant song of birds. His body, accustomed to commanding, to dominating any room with his mere presence, seemed to have shrunk inside his expensive suit. The sweat that had beaded on his forehead was now an icy trickle down his back. He, the billionaire, the man who moved markets with a phone call, who saw presidents bow to his interests, was paralyzed on the porch of a wooden farmhouse before a farmer whose hands held more power than all his vast capital. The reality of the situation was an abyss opening at his feet. Every dollar of his net worth, every share on the stock market, every meticulously planned investment for the past 5 years in this dam now depended on the will of the man he had scorned moments before. The irony was so crushing it left him breathless. He wasn't just wrong, he was a fool. An arrogant fool who had bet his entire fortune on a certainty that turned out to be a mirage. His instinct, honed by decades of ruthless negotiations, screamed at him to attack. Find a flaw, a loophole, a smarter lawyer. He pulled out his cell phone, the automatic gesture of a man who solves all problems with a call. His fingers trembled slightly as he dialed the number of his top lawyer, a man famous for his ability to twist the law until it broke in his favor. "Marcus, I need you now," he hissed into the phone, walking away from Abel and Clara as if distance could somehow diminish the truth stamped on those ancient documents. He paced on the packed dirt, the dust soiling his Italian leather shoes. A detail that on any other day would have infuriated him, but now barely registered. He explained the situation in short, tense phrases, his voice a mixture of disbelief and contained panic. On the other end of the line, Marcus's silence was more terrifying than any objection. It was the silence of an expert recognizing an unsolvable problem. While Richard talked, Clara, with a serenity that disarmed him, approached and offered him a glass of water. Her eyes held no triumph, only a quiet compassion that wounded him more than any accusation. He refused with a sharp nod, unable to accept any gesture of kindness. To accept would be to admit total defeat. Abel remained seated, watching him not with the arrogance of a victor, but with the patience of a mountain, a force of nature that had always been there and always would be. He didn't need to speak. His silence was the most eloquent of statements. He was the owner of the land, the heir to a legacy that Richard's money could neither buy nor erase. The wait for his lawyer's response was the longest of his life. Every second was torture, hope diminishing with each passing moment. He looked out at the vastness of the valley, the green hills, the winding river. Before he saw only resources, potential cash flow, an asset to be exploited for profit. Now, for the first time, he saw the land as it was, a living place, with a history, a soul, a heritage. And he was the intruder, the invader trying to take what was never his. Finally, Marcus's voice came back, heavy and devoid of any solution. "Richard, royal land grants from the colonial era are notoriously ironclad. If those documents are authentic and the line of descent is clear, there's nothing we can do. The property is his, not just the farm. Everything. The legal standing is practically unassailable." The phone slipped from Richard's sweaty hand and fell to the dust with a dull thud. The news of the documents' authenticity spread like wildfire through the corporation's corridors. What began as a disbelieving whisper in the legal department soon became a wave of panic that hit the board of directors and major investors. The dam project, the crown jewel of Richard's business, the investment that promised record dividends for decades, was now built on quicksand. Richard's reputation as an infallible visionary whose touch turned everything to gold began to crumble. The company's stock, which had hit historic highs on the NYSE, began a vertiginous fall. In a few hours, a considerable fraction of his personal fortune had evaporated. The crisis demanded swift, decisive action, but for the first time in his life, Richard felt paralyzed. He locked himself in his temporary office, a modern, glass-walled structure built in the middle of the valley. A cruel irony, as the very ground it stood on now belonged to Abel Hayes. He ignored the dozens of calls from his team, from bankers, and from nervous partners. Silence was his only refuge, a space to try and process the cataclysm that had befallen him. While Richard isolated himself, his second-in-command, Lucas Vance, a man as ambitious as Richard had once been, saw the crisis not as a disaster, but as a golden opportunity. Lucas had always envied Richard's power, his wealth, and the ease with which he commanded the business world. He began to move in the shadows, calling secret meetings, planting seeds of doubt about Richard's competence, and positioning himself as the only one who could save the company from collapse. To Lucas, the situation was simple. Richard had let sentimentality cloud his judgment. The solution wasn't to negotiate, but to crush. He used company capital to hire a new, more aggressive legal team with a single mission: to find any irregularity in Abel Hayes' life, any pretext to invalidate his claim. The strategy was clear: drag the old farmer into a legal war of attrition, drown him in lawsuits and costs until he broke. The first salvo in this war came in the form of a court summons delivered by a sheriff's deputy to Abel's simple house. The document, dozens of pages of intimidating legal jargon, accused him of fraud, of using forged documents to extort the corporation, and demanded millions in compensation for damages. It was a scorched earth tactic, designed to terrify and intimidate. Clara read the summons with trembling hands, her eyes filling with tears of fear and indignation. "Abel, what are we going to do? They're accusing us of being criminals. We have no way to fight this," she whispered, the paper shaking in her hands. Abel held her, his face etched with worry, but his eyes still firm. "Easy now, Clara. The truth is on our side. Their greed can't erase our history." He knew, however, that truth alone might not be enough. They were simple people who lived off the work of their hands. They had never needed a lawyer in their entire lives. How could they face the financial might of a billionaire, a corporate machine designed to destroy anyone who got in its way? The local community, which had once viewed Richard with a mixture of fear and resentment, was now divided. Some, fearing the loss of jobs promised by the dam, turned against Abel. Others, small landowners who had also been pressured to sell their land, saw in Abel a symbol of resistance, an unlikely hero. The tension in the valley was palpable, a calm before the storm. Abel folded the summons carefully and placed it back in the old leather satchel next to the maps and certificates. "Tomorrow, we're going to town," he said, his voice resolute. "We're going to find someone to help us fight for what's rightfully ours." The nearest town was the county seat, a tangle of narrow streets and low-slung buildings, a place where the influence of Richard's corporation was felt everywhere. The company name was on billboards, sponsored the local high school football team, and as Abel and Clara would soon discover, held sway in the corridors of justice. The first lawyer they approached, a white-haired man in a dusty office, barely glanced at the documents. Upon hearing the corporation's name, he shook his head and politely showed them the door, citing a non-existent conflict of interest. The second was more direct, laughing at their audacity. "You want to sue the man who practically owns this county? Find someone else. I value my career." With every closed door, the weight of the legal intimidation grew heavier. Despair began to creep into Clara's heart. But Abel held fast, his determination fueled by the injustice. They had no money for the retainers of big firms, and the small ones were afraid. Lucas's machine was working perfectly, isolating them, making them feel like outcasts in their own land. Just when hope seemed to be fading, a secretary at one of the firms, a young woman who had overheard their story with sympathy, whispered a name to them: Sofia Ramirez, a public defender working out of a small office in the back of the courthouse, known for taking cases no one else would touch. They found her in a room overflowing with case files, a young woman with intelligent, passionate eyes who seemed driven by a sense of justice that money couldn't buy. Sofia listened to their story with rapt attention, her eyes examining the ancient documents with a mixture of fascination and respect. She saw the royal seal, the elegant script, the birth certificate that connected this calloused-handed man to a noble past. Unlike the others, she didn't see a problem, she saw a cause. "This is extraordinary," she said, her voice full of energy. "It's a David and Goliath fight. They'll use all the power and money they have to crush you. It will be hard, but the law and history, they're on your side." For the first time that day, a ray of hope warmed Abel and Clara's hearts. Sofia agreed to represent them, pro bono, moved not by the promise of payment, but by the conviction that she was facing a monumental injustice. That night, as Abel lay awake, memories of his grandfather came to him. He remembered the old man sitting on this very porch, the leather satchel on his lap. "This land has a memory, grandson," his grandfather had said, his voice raspy with age. "It holds the story of our family, the promise that was made. The world out there moves on money, on quick profit. But us, we're guardians. One day, you might need these papers to remind powerful men that there are some things their wealth can't touch." The words, which had seemed so distant at the time, now resonated with prophetic clarity. This was more than a fight for land. It was a fight to honor the memory of his ancestors and protect the legacy for generations to come. Meanwhile, in her office, Sofia spent the night poring over the documents, diving into history books and 18th century land law. The grant was unlike anything she had ever seen. It wasn't a simple deed. It was a royal decree, a grant for services rendered to the crown, and amid the archaic text, she found something that made her hold her breath. A clause, written in ornate English, that granted the baron and his perpetual heirs sovereign rights to the waters that spring from and run through these bounds, and to all minerals the soil holds. Her heart raced. Abel Hayes wasn't just the owner of the land. According to that document, he was the owner of the river that would feed the dam and, potentially, any mineral wealth that lay beneath the valley. Their position was infinitely stronger than anyone, including themselves, could have ever imagined. The mediation room was a cold, impersonal space designed to neutralize emotions, but the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. On one side of the long mahogany table sat the corporation's legal team, 4 lawyers in impeccable suits, exuding the confidence that an army of aides and an unlimited budget provide. Leading them was Lucas, a contemptuous smirk on his face, and beside him Richard, silent and grim, a shadow of the arrogant man who had stood on Abel's porch. On the other side sat Abel Hayes with his serene dignity, Clara, whose presence was a source of quiet strength, and Sofia, the young lawyer who looked even younger and smaller before the phalanx of opponents. The mediator, a retired judge, opened the session with a monotone speech about cooperation and common sense. Lucas's lawyers barely waited for him to finish. They began an overwhelming assault, presenting a mountain of paperwork, motions, and expert opinions, speaking in deliberately confusing legalese. The goal was clear: intimidate, disorient, and demonstrate crushing legal might. They argued that Abel's documents were, at best, historical relics with no validity in the modern world, and at worst, a fraudulent attempt at extortion. They painted the farmer as an opportunist, trying to take advantage of a crucial development project for the region. Richard watched it all with growing discomfort. Every word from his lawyers, every accusation against Abel, echoed his own arrogance, his own cruel words spoken on that same porch. He looked at Abel's calm face and felt a pang of shame. The man didn't have a shred of greed in his eyes. There was only a deep sadness at having his honor questioned. When it was Sophia's turn, the room fell silent. She didn't try to compete with her opponent's volume of paper. Instead, with a clear and steady voice, she told a story. The story of a family, a promise, and a heritage. She unfolded the original map on the table, its fragility a stark contrast to the glossy corporate documents. She explained, in simple terms, Abel's direct lineage, presenting the birth certificates as links in an unbreakable chain. Then, with perfect timing, she revealed her discovery. And, Your Honor, there is also the matter of Clause 7 in the original grant, she said, and read aloud the section about sovereign rights to the waters and minerals. A murmur went through the corporation's side of the table. Lucas shot a look at his lawyers, who were frantically flipping through their papers, caught completely off guard. They had focused on attacking the land ownership, never imagining the rights could extend so much further. Sophia pressed her advantage, arguing that the dam's construction wasn't just trespassing, but a misappropriation of the valley's most valuable resources, resources that belonged, by royal decree, to her client. Lucas's arrogance began to dissolve, replaced by a poorly disguised fury. Richard, on the other hand, felt a strange sensation that wasn't defeat, but something akin to admiration for the young lawyer's cunning and Abel's unshakable strength. The mediator, who had seemed bored before, was now fully engaged, examining the documents with renewed interest. After hours of debate, he closed the session. His recommendation was a devastating blow to the corporation. He denied their motion to dismiss, stating that Abel's claim not only had significant merit, but also raised complex legal and historical precedent questions that needed to be fully explored in court. It was the first victory, small but immensely symbolic. As they left the room, Richard's gaze met Abel's. No words were spoken, but a silent understanding passed between them. The battle was far from over. But the playing field had changed forever. The news of the mediator's decision hit the financial markets like a bombshell. The word unassailable, which once defined Richard's projects, was replaced by uncertain. The corporation's stock value plummeted further, and investors, once loyal, were now calling in a panic, demanding answers Richard didn't have. The pressure was immense, coming from all directions. The board of directors, which had once idolized him, now saw him as the architect of an impending disaster. For every day the dam project was stalled, millions of dollars in interest and contractual penalties accrued, bloating the company's liabilities and threatening its entire net worth. The fortune Richard had spent a lifetime building was unraveling before his eyes. Lucas, smelling blood in the water, intensified his internal campaign. He pitched himself to the board as the only logical alternative, a pragmatic leader who wouldn't be swayed by fables of barons and inheritances. He argued that Richard's hesitation to legally destroy Abel was a sign of weakness, a flaw that was costing everyone dearly. He's emotionally compromised. He's lost his objectivity. We need someone who can make the tough decisions, he'd say in closed-door conversations. Richard felt the circle closing in. Isolated and under attack, he grew increasingly irritable and paranoid. He took his frustration out on his subordinates, his famed strategic calm replaced by outbursts of rage. The nights were long and sleepless, spent in his office, surrounded by charts showing the free fall of his empire. Amid the chaos, a memory from his youth haunted him. He remembered a conversation with his father, a man who had built a modest but solid business on ethics and hard work. "Be careful, son," his father had said. worried by Richard's voracious ambition. Building something big is fine, but never forget that real wealth isn't in the numbers in a bank account. It's in your word, your name, how you treat people. An empire built on the ruin of others is a castle of sand, waiting for the tide. At the time, Richard had dismissed the advice, considering it the philosophy of a small man who didn't understand the world of big business. Now, his father's words echoed in his mind like a prophecy. He had ignored the advice and built his sandcastle exactly where the tide was coming in. Driven by an impulse he didn't quite understand, Richard began to research his own family history, the part his grandfather had made a point to erase. He quietly hired a genealogist, bypassing his corporate channels. He wanted the truth, no matter how painful. Meanwhile, the deadline set by Lucas and his allies on the board was approaching. Their patience had run out. The only way out they offered him was a total, humiliating victory over Abel in court. Anything else would be the end of his career. Desperate, feeling the walls closing in, Richard made an impulsive decision, an act that went against everything he had ever stood for. He didn't call his lawyers, didn't convene a strategy meeting. Instead, late that night, he got in his car and drove alone down the dark gravel road, the headlights cutting through the valley's darkness. He stopped the car some distance from Abel's house, its porch light a welcoming beacon in the vast night. He didn't know what he was going to say or do. He had no plan, only an overwhelming feeling that he needed to look that man in the eye again, away from the lawyers and corporate pressure. Heart-pounding, he got out of the car and walked toward the house, not as a powerful CEO, but as a man on the edge of an abyss, seeking answers from his enemy. Abel was sitting in the rocking chair on the porch, as if he had been expecting him. The sound of the luxury SUV's engine was unmistakable in the country quiet. He showed no surprise, just watched Richard approach, the tall, imposing figure seeming diminished under the starry sky. Clara appeared at the doorway, her face creased with concern, but Abel gave her a reassuring gesture. Richard stopped before the porch, the words caught in his throat. The arrogance was gone, replaced by an exhaustion that seemed to come from his soul. He started, his voice hoarse. I didn't come to make threats. Abel shook his head slowly. I know. Have a seat, sir. Richard hesitated, then walked up the wooden steps and sat in the chair opposite Abel, the same spot where a days ago he had laughed at the old farmer's faith. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the chirping of crickets. Finally, Richard spoke, the words tumbling out in a disorganized rush. I'll offer double, triple, name a number, any number, an amount that will secure your family for generations, a fortune in dollars, in gold, whatever you want. We can set up trusts, investments, anything. Just sign the papers. Let me build the dam. The proposal, which would have once been delivered with contempt, was now a desperate plea. It was the only language Richard knew, the only solution he could conceive. Money. Abel listened patiently, his gaze never leaving Richard's face. When he finished, the old farmer sighed. Sir, you still don't understand. How long has it been since you just stopped to look at these stars? Or smelled the earth after a rain? The question caught Richard off guard. He couldn't remember. I've spent my whole life chasing more, Abel continued, his voice soft. One more deal, 1 more million. I built an empire, but I forgot to build a life. Look at this place. This land isn't an asset on my balance sheet. It is my life. It's my parents' graves and my grandchildren's cradle. Every tree I planted, every harvest, that's my legacy. Your money can't buy the memories buried in this soil. For the first time, Richard's armor cracked completely. He buried his face in his hands, a gesture of total vulnerability. I'm going to lose everything, he whispered, his voice muffled. Everything I've built, my name, my company, my legacy, all of it. At that moment, Clara came out of the house. She carried no documents or words of accusation, but a simple plate with a slice of cornbread and a steaming mug of coffee. She placed it on the small table next to Richard. "You look tired. Eat something," she said, her voice gentle, without a trace of resentment. Richard looked up, stunned. He stared at the plate, at the simplicity of the gesture. In his world, weakness was exploited, vulnerability a weapon to be used against an opponent. Here, on this porch, his weakness was met with compassion. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, living on caffeine and anxiety. Hesitantly, he picked up the mug, its warmth seeping into his cold hands. He took a sip of the coffee. It was strong, sweet, real. Then he ate a piece of the cornbread. The simple, honest taste of homemade food transported him to a time he barely remembered, a time before the obsession with wealth and power. That small act of kindness, of pure and simple humanity, did what billions of dollars and armies of lawyers could not. It shattered Richard's defenses completely. He didn't cry, but something inside him broke. He finished eating in silence, stood up, gave a nearly imperceptible nod of thanks, and left, with no deal, no solution. But as he drove back down the dark road, a profound seed of doubt had been planted. He was no longer just fighting for a project or for money. He was questioning the value of everything he had ever believed in. The change in Richard was subtle, but noticeable. At the crisis meeting the next day, his usual ferocity was gone. Where there would have been sharp orders and a relentless demand for results, there was now a pensive silence. He listened to the aggressive strategies proposed by Lucas and his lawyers to discredit Abel, but his mind was elsewhere, on the taste of cornbread and the dignity of the old farmer. This hesitation did not go unnoticed by Lucas. To him, it was the final confirmation that Richard had become a liability, a leader weakened by emotion. It was time for the final blow. Lucas accelerated his plan. Using Richard's inaction as proof of his incompetence in secret meetings with board members, he presented a detailed contingency plan. A corporate coup to remove Richard as CEO, seize control of the company's assets, and solve the Abel problem with full force, unhindered by Richard's newfound conscience. The board, watching their stock value melt away, was more than receptive. Loyalty in the business world only lasts as long as the profits flow. As the conspiracy to oust him gained momentum, Richard delved deeper into his own personal conspiracy, uncovering his family's truth. The genealogist's report arrived in a plain envelope. With trembling hands, Richard opened it. The documents and records told a sordid story, far worse than he had imagined. His great-great-grandfather, the son of the original Baron, hadn't just disinherited his brother, Abel's ancestor. On paper, he had actively sabotaged him, using his influence and wealth to ruin his businesses, forcing him to move to the rural mountains with almost nothing. The story that they had died in poverty wasn't a mistake, but a deliberate lie, crafted to ensure no descendants would ever come to claim their share of the inheritance. His family's foundational fortune, the base upon which his grandfather and then he himself had built their empires, was consolidated on an act of familial betrayal. Richard felt sick. He wasn't just an aggressive businessman, he was the heir to a line of thieves. The arrogance he had displayed on Abel's porch wasn't just his own, it was a family trait, passed down through generations. He was repeating the sin of his forefathers, using his power and capital to crush the same branch of the family his great-great-grandfather had tried to erase from history. The revelation hit him with the force of a physical blow. He looked out his office window at the valley. The land wasn't just Abel's by legal right, it was his by moral right. His family had stolen that legacy once, and now he was trying to steal it again. The shame consumed him. The fight was no longer about a project or money, it was about redemption. his office door burst open. It was Lucas, flanked by two board members. Their faces were masks of cold determination. There was no more pretense of respect. "Richard," Lucas began, his voice dripping with false formality, "the board has met. The situation is untenable. Your handling of this crisis has been inadequate." One of the board members continued, "We have a vote scheduled for the end of the week to remove you as CEO. However, we're prepared to reconsider." Richard looked at them, the genealogist's report still in his hands. He already knew what was coming. "You have one last chance to save your position and your legacy," Lucas said, savoring every word. "Our lawyers believe we have a strategy to nullify Abel's claim at the final hearing. It's brutal, but effective. You have until then to give the order, crush him in court publicly without mercy, or by the end of the week, you'll be out. No company, no power, no legacy." The ultimatum hung in the air, clear and final. They were giving him a choice: sacrifice what was left of his soul to save his empire, or lose it all. The days following the ultimatum were a blur of anxiety and conflict for Richard. He was trapped in an internal civil war. One part of him, the ruthless CEO trained by decades of corporate battles, screamed at him to take the deal, fight, win at all costs, protect the business and the fortune that had defined his identity his entire life. It was the path of survival, the basic instinct that had gotten him to the top. He sat in meetings with his legal team, listening as they detailed the strategy to destroy Abel Hayes' reputation. They planned to portray him as a liar, a greedy man who had hoarded the documents for generations, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. It was a vicious narrative, a complete inversion of the truth, but legally plausible and potentially effective with a jury. Every word they spoke turned Richard's stomach. He saw Abel's serene face, the kindness in Clara's eyes, and the thought of subjecting them to a public humiliation was torture. The other part of him, his newly awakened conscience, begged him to stop. This voice, once a whisper, was now a roar. It reminded him of the genealogist's report, of the historical injustice that stained his family's name. To continue the fight would not just be a business act, it would be perpetuating a generational crime. It would be the final confirmation that he was no better than his treacherous great-great-grandfather. The weight of this choice was crushing him. He barely ate, barely slept. He paced his luxury penthouse like a ghost. The symbols of his wealth, the art, the panoramic city views, now seeming hollow and mocking. He remembered a specific detail unearthed by the genealogist's research. A bitter letter, written by Abel's ancestor to his brother, Richard's great-great-grandfather. In it, he didn't ask for money, but lamented the broken bond of brotherhood and trust. "May your wealth bring you comfort," he had written, "for you have built it on the ruin of your own blood. May God have mercy on your soul." Richard felt as if the letter had been written to him. Meanwhile, in the valley, Abel, Clara, and Sophia prepared for the battle of their lives. Oblivious to Richard's inner turmoil, they were expecting the worst. Sophia worked tirelessly, preparing their defense, anticipating every dirty trick the corporation's lawyers might pull. She focused her strategy not just on the legality of the documents, but on the integrity of her clients. She gathered testimonies from neighbors, church records, and community stories that painted a picture of the Hayes family. Honest, hard-working people, deeply connected to their land for generations. Abel, for his part, prepared in his own way. He didn't study law books. He walked his land, touching the trees, feeling the soil under his feet. He drew strength not from arguments, but from his roots, from the certainty of who he was and what he belonged to. "Whatever God wills," he told an apprehensive Clara, "our greatest defense is the truth." The night before the final hearing arrived, heavy and silent for everyone involved. It felt as if the fate of the valley and their very lives would be decided in the coming hours. In his office, Richard stared at the phone on his desk. On one side, Lucas's number, waiting for the confirmation to unleash the full attack in court. On the other, the darkness outside. He felt the weight of generations on his shoulders. The choice wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about what kind of man he wanted to be. Finally, with a resolution that surprised him, he picked up the phone, but he didn't call Lucas or his lawyers. He dialed a different number, one he had secretly obtained days earlier. "Hello, is this the news desk?" he said, his voice firm for the first time in days. "My name is Richard Caldwell, and I have a story for you." The courtroom was packed. The story of the dispute between the billionaire and the humble farmer had become a media sensation. A modern-day David and Goliath tale that had captured the public's imagination. Reporters, camera crews, and curious onlookers jostled for a seat. On one side, the corporate team, led by a visibly tense Lucas, who shot furious glances at Richard. Richard remained impassive, his face an unreadable mask, much to the frustration of Lucas, who still hadn't received the go-ahead for the attack. On the other side, Abel, Clara, and Sophia sat together, a small island of calm in the ocean of tension. Abel wore his best suit, a little worn but clean, and stared straight ahead with a serenity that seemed unshakable. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The hearing began. Lucas's lead attorney, a man known for his courtroom aggression, rose to give his opening statement. He began to paint the portrait of Abel Hayes as a calculating opportunist, using venomous language that made Sophia's blood boil. When it was time to call the first witness, he called Abel Hayes to the stand. The plan was clear: demoralize him from the start, bombard him with leading questions about his finances, about why he had waited so long to reveal the documents, insinuating that the whole thing was an extortion scheme. Abel walked slowly to the witness stand, each step echoing in the tense silence. He took the oath, his voice steady. The corporate lawyer approached. Like a predator closing in on its prey, he opened his mouth to ask the first question, a question designed to humiliate and destabilize. But before a sound could escape, a voice rang out through the courtroom, clear and commanding, "Stop!" Every head turned. Richard was on his feet. His face was no longer a mask. It was alive with an emotion no one there could decipher. Lucas hissed at him, "Sit down! What are you doing?" Richard ignored him. He looked at his lawyers, at the judge, and finally at Abel on the witness stand. There was an apology in his eyes. "I said, stop," he repeated, louder this time. The lawyer recoiled, confused. The judge, annoyed by the interruption, banged his gavel. "Mr. Caldwell, what is the meaning of this? Control yourself, or you will be removed from this courtroom." Richard was undeterred. In a move that shocked everyone, he walked to the front of the courtroom, past his own stunned legal team. He stood directly before the judge, a man he knew socially, a man who, like many in power, had once benefited from his influence. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption," Richard said, his voice now calm and controlled, echoing through the entire court. "But this entire proceeding is a sham, and I can no longer be a part of it." A shocked murmur swept the room. Lucas went pale, looking as if he might faint. Sophia stared, dumbfounded, from Richard to Abel, who watched the scene with an expression of pure disbelief. The judge peered over his glasses. "Explain yourself, Mr. Caldwell, and be quick about it." Richard took a deep breath, the weight of a lifetime of decisions on his shoulders. He turned slightly so he could address not just the judge, but everyone in the room, especially Abel. "Your Honor, I wish to formally withdraw all of my company's lawsuits against Mr. Hayes. Furthermore, I wish to state publicly, under oath, that his claim of ownership over the valley is, by all the evidence I myself have investigated, legitimate and unquestionable. The land belongs to him." Chaos erupted. Richard's statement detonated like a bomb in the silent courtroom. Reporters scrambled for the exits, shouting into their phones. Lucas leaped from his chair, his face red with fury. "Objection! My client is clearly under duress. He is not of sound mind," he yelled at the judge, who banged his gavel repeatedly, trying in vain to restore order. But it was too late. The story of the day, of the week, perhaps of the year, had just happened. Richard stood impassively amidst the storm he had created. He felt a tremendous weight lift from his shoulders, a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in decades. His net worth, which he could almost feel plummeting in real time as the news hit the markets, suddenly seemed irrelevant. He had lost an empire, but he had regained something infinitely more valuable: his integrity. Abel and Clara were frozen in place, staring at Richard with a mixture of shock and awe. Sophia, next to them, had tears in her eyes, not just for the legal victory, but for the extraordinary human turnaround she had just witnessed. When the session was finally suspended amidst the turmoil, Richard was surrounded by his now former team. Lucas confronted him, his face twisted with rage. "You've destroyed everything, everything. For some sentimental old fool and a worthless piece of land. The board will ruin you. You will lose every cent you ever made." Richard looked at him with a calm that infuriated him further. "You never understood, did you, Lucas? It was never about the land. It was about what was right." He turned away from the furious group and walked toward Abel, Clara, and Sophia, who were now being mobbed by the press. He made his way through the reporters. "Please, give them some space," he said, his old authority resurfacing for a moment. Surprised, the journalists fell back a step. He stood before Abel. For the first time, he looked the man in the eye, not as an adversary, not as a CEO, but as a distant kinsman, a man seeking redemption. "Mr. Hayes," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "there are no words to express how sorry I am. Not just for my actions, but for the actions of my family. For over a century of greed and injustice. I hope that one day you can forgive me." Clara, with tears streaming down her face, did something unexpected. She reached out and touched Richard's arm. "God bless you, son," she whispered. In that moment of fragile, powerful connection, a reporter's phone buzzed loudly with a breaking news alert. The journalist read it aloud. "Terrigen's board has just announced the immediate removal of Richard Caldwell as CEO. Lucas Vance has been appointed interim successor. In his first statement, Vance says the company does not recognize Caldwell's confession, calling it a betrayal, and will sue both Caldwell for breach of fiduciary duty and Mr. Hayes, vowing to fight with every legal resource to secure the company's rights to the Valley. The fight, it seemed, was far from over. Richard had surrendered, but the machine he had created, now helmed by a man with no scruples, was still moving forward, more determined and dangerous than ever. Lucas's new offensive was immediate and brutal. Freed from the constraints of Richard's conscience, he launched an all-out war. The first battlefront was the media. A well-funded smear campaign began to paint Abel as a con artist, and Richard as an unstable man who had suffered a nervous breakdown. The second front was legal. Company lawyers filed dozens of motions, freezing all of Richard's personal assets, claiming his courtroom confession had caused billion-dollar losses to shareholders. Overnight, Richard found himself without access to his own fortune, a billionaire on paper but penniless in practice. For Abel and Clara, the pressure was even more direct. Lucas used his political connections to fast-track permits and begin moving heavy machinery to the edges of the property, a clear act of intimidation, testing the limits of the court's restraining order. The situation seemed hopeless. They had won the moral battle, but were about to lose the war of attrition. It was then that Richard's final plan, set in motion that night before the hearing, came into play. The call he had made wasn't to just any reporter, but to an award-winning investigative journalist known for her tenacity and for exposing corporate corruption. He had given her everything: the genealogist's report, internal documents proving the company knew about the risks of Abel's claim and ignored them, and most importantly, a full confession of his own predatory tactics over the years. He had handed her the key to destroying the empire he had built. The story was published online and went viral within minutes. It was a devastating exposé. The narrative was no longer just about a farmer and his land. It was about a century of greed, family betrayal, and a toxic corporate culture. Lucas's story of an unstable CEO crumbled. In its place emerged the story of a man seeking redemption by exposing the rotten core of his own system. Public opinion, already sympathetic to Abel, now turned furiously against the corporation. Protesters gathered outside the company headquarters and in the valley. The scandal went international. Institutional investors, fearing the stain on their reputation, began dumping their stock en masse. What had been a slide became a total collapse. In less than 48 hours, the company's market value was a fraction of what it had been. The company was on the verge of bankruptcy. Lucas, cornered and panicking, tried one last gambit, calling an emergency meeting with what was left of the board. He proposed a radical plan to declare bankruptcy and restructure, salvaging what he could. But it was too late. The board, now facing dozens of shareholder lawsuits and a federal investigation, saw that Lucas wasn't a savior, but the captain sinking the ship. In a swift, unanimous vote, they fired him. Facing total ruin, the board knew they had to negotiate to save any remnant of the company. But they didn't call their lawyers. They didn't call Richard, the man they had betrayed. In a final act of desperation and surrender, the chairman of the board picked up the phone, asked his secretary for the number of the public defender's office in the small North Carolina town, and asked to speak to the legal representative of the true owner of the valley. The call wasn't to Sophia, it was to the man they had tried to destroy. They asked to schedule a meeting with Mr. Abel Hayes. The meeting took place where it all began, on the porch of Abel's simple house. This time, however, the roles were dramatically reversed. The men in expensive suits, board members of the ruined corporation, looked small and defeated, sitting in the rustic chairs. On the other side, Abel sat in his rocking chair, not as a conqueror, but with the same calm as always. Beside him, as his advisors, were Sophia, whose reputation now preceded her, and Richard, dressed in simple clothes, without the weight of power, but with the clear purpose of a redeemed man. The executives offered a complete surrender. They were willing to cede the property, pay damages, anything to avoid total liquidation and legal fallout. They expected Abel to demand a fortune, to seek revenge, but Abel wasn't interested in revenge. He didn't want to destroy the company, he wanted to heal the valley. After hearing their offer, Abel turned to Richard. "Mr. Caldwell, what would you do?" he asked, not as a test, but as a genuine request for advice. Richard looked at the men who had betrayed him, without bitterness, and then at the land he had learned to respect. The dam, if done right, smaller, safer, respecting the river's course, could bring clean energy and jobs, Richard said, thinking not as a CEO, but as a planner. The company has the technology, the knowledge. What it lacked was a soul. Inspired by this, and guided by his own wisdom, Abel made his counterproposal, drafted with the help of Sophia and Richard. He didn't want a cash settlement that would go into his pocket. Instead, he proposed the creation of a new kind of entity. The corporation would be radically restructured. Abel would lease, on a long-term basis, the land strictly necessary for the construction of a sustainable, ecological dam, a project redesigned by Richard. In return, a majority stake in the new company, 51%, would be transferred to a perpetual trust fund. The dividends generated by these shares would not go to an individual, but would be forever reinvested in the valley community, in schools, hospitals, environmental preservation, and sustainable agriculture projects. The board members were stunned. It was a solution no one could have imagined. It would save the company from extinction, preserve jobs, and most importantly, transform a symbol of corporate greed into a model of social responsibility. It was a chance at redemption, not just for Richard, but for the entire organization. They accepted immediately. The agreement was signed right there on the wooden porch table. The pen that sealed the fate of billions of dollars in assets was a simple ballpoint pen, borrowed from Clara. The arc of suffering found its resolution. Abel, the guardian of the land, became the guardian of his community's future. Sophia, the idealistic young defender, became a key player in creating a new legal framework for conscientious business. And Richard found his redemption. He had lost his net worth, but he helped create a new kind of wealth, one that was shared and that nourished instead of exploited. He was no longer a billionaire in dollars, but he was a man immensely rich in purpose. Peace finally settled over the valley. Not the peace of silence, but the peace of justice and renewed hope. A year later, the valley was a transformed place. The dust from bulldozers had been replaced by the green of new crops. Construction on the new dam, smaller and more harmonious with the landscape, was underway, employing hundreds of local residents. Next to the construction site, a new, modern building stood out. The Valley Community Center, the first major project funded by the trust fund's dividends. Inside, it housed a school with state-of-the-art equipment, a small health clinic, and an agricultural co-op that helped local farmers sell their produce at fair prices. The wealth generated by the land now returned to the land and its people. Prosperity was no longer measured by the cash flow of a distant corporation, but by the health of the children and the quality of the harvest. Abel's story had become a legend, a symbol that faith and integrity could, in fact, move mountains, or, in this case, stop bulldozers. On a warm afternoon, Richard stood in the middle of a cornfield, the sweat on his brow mixing with the dust of the earth. He wore worn jeans and a simple shirt, and his hands, once soft and accustomed to signing checks, were now calloused from labor. He was no longer a CEO or a consultant. He had found a new role, working alongside Abel, using his vast knowledge of agronomy and management not to maximize profit, but to optimize soil health and the sustainability of the crops. He had lost his fortune, his status, his luxury goods. But as he looked at the green hills, the free-flowing river, and the children leaving the new school, he felt a kind of net worth that no stock market could ever calculate. He found Abel resting in the shade of a large maple tree, the old leather satchel beside him. They sat in silence for a while, watching the valley they had saved together. You know, Richard said, breaking the silence, I spent my whole life accumulating things, assets, stocks, crypto, trying to build something that would last forever. And in the end, the most lasting thing I've ever done was help preserve something that was already here all along. Abel smiled, a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. The land doesn't belong to us, Mr. Caldwell. We belong to it. We're just its caretakers for a while. Just then, Clara approached, carrying a tray with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. The same coffee that, a year earlier, had begun the demolition of Richard's world and the rebuilding of his soul. This time, he accepted it with a genuine, grateful smile. He held the warm mug in his calloused hands, taking in the familiar aroma. He took a sip, the strong, sweet taste filling his mouth. It was the taste of home, of redemption, of peace. He looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in colors of hope. He had come to this valley a conquering king, ready to take everything. And in losing everything, he had finally gained the world.